Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Iante Mosselman. I'm program editor at De Bali. And you're watching the first episode of a new series called People of Europe. It is 75 years since World War II ended this year. And therefore, we've asked prominent thinkers and historians to reflect on Europe and its people. And for this night, we have groundbreaking philosopher Susan Neiman here. She studied philosophy at Harvard and at the Vrije Universiteit Berlin. She taught philosophy at Yale and at Tel Aviv University. She's the author of many books, for instance, Evil in Modern Thought. And I have a few of them lying here. And this is her latest. What we can learn from the German, but in Dutch is wat we van de Duitsers kunnen leren. And it's a brilliant book, really relevant, and we'll get to that. Thank you, Susan, for being here. Oh, I'm forgetting to say one thing. If you have any questions, you can ask them online. Go to sli.do. And the program code is 30298. That's it. Susan, welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. It would have been more of a pleasure to be there in person as we'd planned originally, but I'm glad we managed to set this up.
Good to hear. We've asked you to write an essay on the question, should there be, could there be, is there a European demos? A question you reframed a little to the question, does anything hold Europeans together? And I wanted to start by quoting a sentence from your essay. You write, like the proverbial fish who doesn't really know what water is, Europeans swim in frameworks that seem so self-evident they forget to appreciate them.
Indeed, they do. Now, I don't know whether I'm saying they or we here because I became officially a European myself in 2017 after Donald Trump became president of the United States. I had spent more of my adult life in Europe than outside of it, but I was okay with having this strange insider status until November 2016. But although I really identify with Europe and with the European project, I was socialized as an American. So I think I see the water better than many of the other fish do, since I jumped into it, fairly late in life. I guess I was 28 when I first came to live in Berlin. And what I mean by that is that, believe me, I know there's a huge gap between the European ideal and the European reality. But I fear that so many people within Europe spend all of their time focusing on the gap that they absolutely forget the ideal, which has been partly realized. And, if you don't acknowledge that some progress has been made, you will be resigned about the possibility of making any further progress. So I'm not being blue-eyed or naive about this. I'm simply saying recognize what you've got. And that's particularly clear to someone who grew up in the American system.
And you grew up in the South. This is also something you write about a lot in your latest book. How did that growing up there shape you and your research?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to figure out which direction we want to go in for this conversation. I mean, growing up in the South was important for me because I grew up in the middle of the civil rights movement. My mother was a civil rights activist, and I think the sense of justice as something that, that's just what people do. You fight against racism and you fight for universal justice. And although I wouldn't have said it at the time, I think that had a big role eventually in my going on to study philosophy, and certainly in my taking a very universalist Enlightenment view, despite all the I think, usually unfair criticisms that people make of the Enlightenment these days. So that was particular about the South. But what growing up in the United States did for me, in many ways, was to make European social systems seem utopian. And when I explain them to my American friends and colleagues, even those who are really very well educated, they are shocked. And I'll give you one instance that's become very, I mean, there are many, many things, but this has become very acute during the pandemic. Americans, I'm sure you know, most educated Europeans know, that there's no universal healthcare system. The American Constitution guarantees everyone the right to own as many guns as they like, but it guarantees no right to healthcare. And one of the first things that President Obama tried to do was to at least, if not absolutely, have a healthcare system on a European model to push something in that direction. And of course, it was extremely hard for him to get even fairly minor reforms through. But that's a story that I think Europeans know and have puzzled over. What they don't know, which in some ways has even become worse and more horrifying during the pandemic crisis, Americans don't have the right to be sick. No. That is, if you get sick in the United States, too sick to go to work. If you're very lucky and you have a generous employer, you have a fixed number of sick days every year, somewhere from 5 to 10. Okay. And so, whether it's cancer or whether it's COVID, you can stay home and you will continue to get paid. That is for 60% of the population, but it's an act of generosity on the part of your employer. And it is called, in American parlance, a benefit. Mm-hmm. No one thinks of it as a right. 40% of Americans have no such benefit at all. And those 40%, of course, are on the bottom rungs of the economy. What that means is that the people who are stocking the grocery stores, carrying the packages, delivering, whatever, picking up the garbage, all of these essential services that those of us who are lucky enough to have jobs that allow us to work from a home office absolutely depend on in order to live. Those people do not have the right to get sick. If they have a nice boss, they can call in sick, but they won't get paid, and then they might lose their home. If they don't have a nice boss, they can simply be fired. Now, people are suddenly realizing, wait a second, a pandemic, this could actually endanger other people. Now, what I want to point to is the difference between the way you are shaking your head in disgust at this system and what happens when I explain to Americans how it works in Europe, okay? And there's a different amount of, I looked all this up. Poland only gives you 50 days a year. Mm-hmm. The Netherlands gives you, I think, 102 weeks or something. I mean, so there's a variation. But the idea that there's a set of social rights, and they include labor rights, they include vacation, they include leave if you have a baby, they include a right to free education. All of that stuff, considered as a human right, is something that's completely absent in the United States. And then again, if I tell people, then I have these conversations sometimes, and I start feeling embarrassed at my good fortune, because I will tell Americans and they just start getting glummer and glummer. But it's a conceptual shift that they haven't yet made. And that, again, is the kind of framework that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. This is not to say that every social system in every country in Europe is adequate. Of course it's not. And of course there's inequality. I mean, this is when I regularly talk about this in the States. I say, listen, there's inequality, there's capitalism, there's even homelessness, all that good stuff. You can still have it and have a basic conception of what a social right is. And that's something Europeans do not sufficiently appreciate.
And how come that the Europeans have all these social rights while the Americans have not?
It's called socialism. And I mean, look, there was a very strong labor movement at the end of the 19th century. I don't know enough about the Dutch case, so you'll have to educate me about that. I do know that in Germany, Bismarck, who was chancellor at the time, was the first to offer a whole slate of social rights because people were afraid that real socialists were going to actually take over and put in something worse. How and why that got preserved through the Second World War and through the end of the Cold War is an interesting and complicated historical question. But we didn't have that. We had a strong socialist movement, or a fairly strong socialist movement in the 30s. And that movement pushed Roosevelt into something like a social democratic, it's much, much weaker than in Europe, but a social democratic understanding of rights, having pensions, for example, and a certain amount of labor rights. How the United States managed to pathologize socialism after the Second World War is a very long and sad story. But it exists to this day. And it's one of the reasons, it's the main reason why Bernie Sanders did not win the nomination for the Democratic Party. The funny thing is that Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist, but his actual program, if you look at it carefully, is to the right of any Christian democratic government in Europe. No one would accept the few demands that he made, basically for a universal health care system, a minimum wage, some parental leave. You have to understand, you have a baby in the United States, there is no law guaranteeing that the mother or the father has any time off from work. I mean, this is just, again, it's left up to individual employers, and it's a matter of a benefit rather than a right. Bernie Sanders, who I, of course, voted for in the primary, I think did himself in, and there's something that I find rather sweet about his calling himself a socialist, even though it's really not true. He's a kind of right-wing social democrat, but he has a strong sense of historical justice. And he knows the degree to which the United States tried to, and successfully in many places, did overthrow social democratic revolutions in other countries. And somebody dug up a statement he had made in the 70s saying something nice about Cuba. And he said, and was asked, Senator Sanders, can you possibly support this horrible government? And he quite rightly answered, well, I don't support any authoritarian government, neither in Cuba, nor in Saudi Arabia, nor in China, but they have a very good universal healthcare system. Yes. This is his thing, And when he was asked about that, he doubled down, and I think it lost him, even among so-called liberals, an awful lot of votes. And what's really so shocking, I mean, I've been to Cuba, good heavens. Cuba is, if you want to look at human rights abuses across the world, Yeah, Cuba's really on the low end of that, but it has been demonized for 60 years in the United States. So anyway, so much for chances for American social democracy, although, we're in an interesting historical moment, and maybe it's not as hopeless as it looked a couple months ago.
No, because you just said as well, the Americans haven't made that conceptual shift yet. So do you think there is do you think this shift is a possibility?
I do, because the pandemic, there's a reason why the United States has done worse than any country in the world during the pandemic. Highest number of cases, highest number of deaths. And it's not only because we have an idiot in the White House, although that certainly helps.
Yeah.
The person in the White House has no interest in anything but securing his own power. So, and, as many people have said besides me, it's not simply that he wants to lie all the time. The Washington Post, which is really not a far left media, has been counting the lies that he's made since taking office, and they've counted 19,000 and something, okay? So it's an average of 15 straight out lies every day. But as I was just reading a good piece in the New York Times, also really not a very far left newspaper, it's not only that he lies, it's that he really doesn't care about the distinction between truth and lies. He'd really like to wipe out that distinction. So, of course, this is one of the reasons why the United States did so badly. But the other set of reasons, that we have no labor rights, that we have no universal health care, that so many things are left up to individual states, all of that suddenly became quite conscious to many people. And even Joe Biden, who's really a very centrist Democrat, but also many of the people in Congress, are suddenly making much stronger demands than they would have. It would still, even the best case, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would not put through as firm a package of social and labor rights as we have in Europe. Mm-hmm. But things are moving.
I was wondering about that. Would you say the bad conditions of social rights and labor rights in the USA, would that be also something that triggered the enormous amount of people who are now protesting for Black Lives Matter? Do you think that also has an influence?
Yes, absolutely. Again, you said bad conditions of social rights. How about, let's just say, there are no social rights. There are benefits, and it's a very different concept, okay? So, yes, that has become clear to people. It's also become clear to people that 3 times African Americans have become are 3 times more likely to be sick with coronavirus. And it's quite an extraordinary figure, partly having to do with just simple poverty and the need to take more of these now quite dangerous jobs without any opportunity to shelter in place. But I think there's paradoxically something else that has happened with the coronavirus. And I hope, because none of us know where this is going to go, I think fears of a second wave of the virus are, quite realistic. But I also think, so I'm not making any predictions about the way things are going. Journalists always want you to make predictions.
I know. So do I.
I don't know whether the United States is going to have a civil war. I don't know who's going to win the election in November. And I don't know whether the coronavirus will be a turning point for humankind. But it does open possibilities. And that's very important. I think what we've seen in the last 3 months is a host of things that did not seem possible before. Take, climate change. Most of us fly too much. Mea culpa, I know I do. Even if I've tried to take more trains than planes usually. Okay. And climate change activists have, of course, for a couple of years said we all need to fly less, but it won't happen. People are not going to give up their cheap EasyJet flights. And all of a sudden, 95% of the air traffic of the world is grounded. All of the things that people said this will never happen. Every time activists have asked for new social programs, fight homelessness, fight poverty. We've always heard from the governments, unfortunately, there's not enough money. We'd love to help, but be realistic. The money's not there. All of a sudden, trillions of dollars were freed up because everyone was rightly afraid the entire world economy was going to collapse if there wasn't money put into subsidies, both for businesses and for people who couldn't work. So this sense, wait a second, maybe more is possible than we've been told all along is, I think, very strong.
And that's a big difference from other protests that have been going on before, maybe, that realization, do you mean?
Yes, exactly.
And is that the only difference, do you think, that is taking part, or are there more things different now, do you think?
So, that's a pretty big difference for a start. Look, I think that Donald Trump represents the apex of a set of trends that have been, polluting the world for the last 30 years. Presents a neoliberalism that says really the only value that counts is material value that you can weigh and measure. The only real pleasure or joy is buying stuff and owning stuff. The only thing, truth is just a matter of power. There's several intellectual currents. I wrote a little book about this, which has been translated into Dutch. I don't know what it's called. My last book was called Resistance and Reason in English and in German. In which I talked about the various intellectual trends, so neoliberal economics, post-structuralist theory of truth, certain forms of identity politics, and also evolutionary psychology, which thinks you can explain all human behavior by our remote ancestors' desire to reproduce themselves. It's really an interesting moment because that has been completely taken over as absolute science. There's no scientific basis for it whatsoever. This is not to say there's no scientific basis for evolution. Of course there is, but not for evolutionary psychology as a way of explaining human behavior. But what I wrote in that book is, all we have to do is look within ourselves, much less to look at the rest of history to realize, actually, I do care about other things than money. I do think there's a difference between truth and lies, and it's not all just a matter of power. And I really am driven to do other things than reproduce copies of myself, But Trump is actually like that. Trump might be the one human being in the world who embodies these three ideologies, and they are ideologies in the sense that they're ideas that are resistant to facts, they're resistant to evidence. And of course, he's caused problems for the United States in the first instance, but unfortunately, the whole world has been looking at him with revulsion, usually. And I think the sense that this is where we were going, if something doesn't stop, that's where we're ending up. I think a lot of people all over the world, certainly in the United States, but all over the world, have said, wait a second, that is not where human civilization should end.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I want to go to another thing you touch upon in your essay. And it's about, you write about, as I said in the beginning, that Europeans don't appreciate the rights that they have. And one of the things you say there's a lot of frameworks that they have that they don't appreciate. And one of them is the idea of a cultural framework as something that isn't fixed by God or nature, is common to Europeans. So that idea, can you tell me what you mean by that?
I hate to dump on my country folk because there are a lot of very wonderful Americans, and they have, taught the world and given the world a great deal culturally. But because the country is so large, and this is very important to remember, Americans have no right to vacation. Vacation, too, of course, is a benefit and not a right. Mm-hmm. You have very generous benefits. After many years of work, you might get 3 weeks of vacation a year. This is huge. To be divided among, all of your family obligations, whatever it is, so that if you do go and live in a different country, it won't be for long enough for most people to really get a sense of how things are done differently. And what that means is not just the particularities of things are done differently in Holland than they are in Germany and in France, and not to mention in Brazil and so on. But the idea that there is a way that people do things differently is it's very hard for many Americans to grasp. And I've run into this with good friends who are educated. They still see the American way of life as the default way of life, and everything else is kind of an interesting deviation from it, if it even gets noticed. Whereas Europeans, of course, are used to, first of all, Europeans have generous vacations. They live next to each other. Mm-hmm. They're likely to learn more languages. And they're simply used to the idea, okay, this is how they do things in France. This is how they do things in Sweden. And, you'll have friends in different countries and you can talk about those differences. Whereas that's much harder for an American to do. Let me add, I haven't lived in China. I don't know what it's like. In another large, basically imperial country where that may be the case elsewhere. Although friends of mine who've taught in China are always impressed by how well educated, at least the Chinese that they meet, are in the languages and cultures of other Western cultures. So my real basis of comparison are these two areas. Mm-hmm. But there's a richness, again, that Europeans, I think, take for granted. Not just that it's nice to get an easy jet or hopefully, a train and go to Mallorca or Italy, but that the concept of very different cultures is an enriching concept.
There's two things I want to ask you about this. And the first is, you say that this framework is not the most important, but it's the basis of many others. And I was wondering on which others?
I mean, I just think the idea that things can change, that the world is not as fixed as, again, Americans tend to think of it as. That, if they have certain rights in one place or, certain public subsidies of culture in another place, you can also think about, let's do it this way. It's one of these things that, again, it's hard to appreciate because it's so basic. It's this ground level thing, but it is important.
I of course, I like you saying this, and as someone who thinks of themselves as a tolerant, like living in a tolerant country, well, you could very much also argue against that, because at the same time, I think that not only in the Netherlands, but also in the whole of Europe, and also in America, of course, and also in many other places in the world, you see that our openness to other cultures is under threat, I would say, more and more. Also in the Netherlands, there's a tendency of our culture is the best culture, and trying to keep other cultures out. How do you look at that?
Well, one way I look at it is by hating the word tolerance, because with the word tolerance comes the idea, my culture is the best, but I will tolerate some others for the sake of the peace. I know that, Holland is very proud of tolerance, and many other people think it's the first virtue of the Enlightenment. It's not. And the interesting thing, if you want to look at it historically, the whole discussion of tolerance was about tolerating different religions, not about different cultures. It was about tolerating other people's views about what was necessary for salvation, okay? And the idea of, okay, I believe that everybody will go to hell if they don't follow my version of Christianity, but I don't want to start another war over it, is very different from, you can't transfer that to cultural or ethnic tolerance. When you say I'm tolerant, what you mean is, if you use it in sort of ordinary language, what do you tolerate ordinarily? You tolerate a headache if the aspirin doesn't work. You tolerate the neighbor who's making noise upstairs if you can't get him to turn down his radio. You tolerate things that you don't like and can't do anything about. And so I think it's been a very dangerous concept. That's the first thing. What you want to do with other cultures is respect them, be interested in them, not tolerate them. Realize that your own culture is interesting and full of treasure, and probably also full of some things that you'd rather do without. That's important to know when you're thinking about a culture. But also to realize that your life will be enriched by learning about other cultures. It's not simply a matter of toleration. So that's the first step. But secondly, I think we also need to acknowledge that Europeans have a problem with people of color, and that it's easier to tolerate or to be interested in other white cultures than it is to respect and be interested in the cultures of people of color. And one of the things that I hope from the present uprisings, and I think we really need to look at those as uprisings, is that you have people really, honestly, from Bristol to Belgium to Brisbane, standing up in solidarity with Black Lives Matter in America, and at the same time saying we need to look at our history of racism towards non-European people. And I am quite hopeful, because if you look at these demonstrations all across the world, there are actually more white people than people of color. It's a universalist moment. And I just hope it stays that way.
And in dealing with the past, of course, is you wrote really impressive book about that. And if you look at the protests now, you also just said that they have a lot to do with how we deal with the past. Why is that?
Well, look, Europeans have been very slow in coming to terms with the history of colonialism. And I think there's an interesting and complicated reason that I didn't write too much about in the book, because it's only, after you write a book and then people talk to you about it and you realize, well, actually that I should have added, or, so I may do that in the second edition. I think one of the things that has made it easier for Europeans not to look at their colonial history is that the end of colonialism came, or at least explicit colonialism, came right after the Second World War, in which everybody but Germany was really a victim of Germany. And so you have deep in this national history, it's very, very strong in Britain, but it was also clear when I went to once I was in The Hague and I went to the History Museum in The Hague, we were occupied by the Nazis, we suffered, and we fought back. Of course, the Dutch can't really say they fought back. The Brits certainly can, okay? And there's a way in which Nazi crimes were so awful that it's very easy to focus on them and say, well, they weren't, nobody even considers colonialism, because we've defined what evil is. Evil is rounding people up, putting them in cattle cars and gassing them at the end of their journey. So we don't need to look at other forms of evil in the 20th century. And colonialism certainly was an evil. And, even after the direct theft, exploitation, and enslavement of indigenous peoples in the colonies stopped, the attitudes that allowed that to happen, the racism that you had in the 19th century, in which most Europeans simply considered European culture to be superior to any others, those attitudes have persisted. I want to point out, because lots and lots of people think this is the fault of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. That the Enlightenment universalism was really Eurocentric. This is wrong. The Enlightenment was the first movement to actually criticize Eurocentrism and to insist that Europeans have much to learn from other countries. And all of the great Enlightenment philosophers actually said that. It was the 19th century when colonialism really got going, where you had this, all the other cultures are inferior and we are bringing them Christianity and railroads and, whatever else we brought them. But I've been, honestly, I wrote this book. It came out last fall in English and this spring in Dutch and German. And I had hoped to contribute to something like what's happening now, in the sense that I truly believe if nations do not face the bad parts of their past, the evil parts of their past, they will not be able to have a sane and healthy future. So I very much hoped to be a voice for that kind of change. I honestly couldn't imagine that you would see this international movement. Yeah.
And why is that, do you think? Why is it that if you ignore your past, you're going to head the wrong way?
Well, let's just take the colonial question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The Europeans don't own any colonies anymore. We can talk about, what corporate colonialism is and all of that, but there are no colonies anymore. But there is, as you yourself pointed out, still quite a lot of racism in Europe towards people of color. And it's because the attitudes that, went along with colonialism and allowed colonialism to flourish, were never examined. And you have, of course, the same thing in the United States, that slavery ended. There were forms of neo-slavery that I discuss in the book that continued basically until 1964, some of them. But it was never really acknowledged. We thought, okay, we're done with that. Yes, we used to hang people from trees. Well, not even that has ended, by the way, in the United States. But because it was never faced by the large part of the population, of course, there were historians who wrote about it, but there's a big gap between what historians write in the archives and what ordinary, educated people think they need to know about the history of their country. I didn't know very much about the history of the United States, honestly. I wasn't that interested. I was interested in other stuff. I was interested in Europe. I was interested in the Enlightenment. I was interested in the history of the Cold War and the history of socialism. I never studied the history of America between the Civil War, 1865, it ended, and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in 1955. So that's 90 years that I just didn't know about, and I'm an educated person. You can imagine what somebody with less access to education. But if we don't know those facts, we don't see how the attitudes and even the situations persist. And I think it's not wrong to call George Floyd's death a lynching, because we have never fully acknowledged the ways in which lynching was a part of American culture. And I hope you're surprised to hear this. There has never been a national law against lynching. Finally, in 2018, yes, I know, it's shocking. Finally, in 2018, Congress had prepared a law against lynching named after Emmett Till, one of the most famous victims of lynching. I have to devote a whole chapter to his murder in the book. Last week, the Congress was preparing to ratify this bill and put it into law and stuff. One Republican senator, on the first day of the memorial services for George Floyd, one Republican senator refused to let it pass. Oh. So we still don't have a national law against lynching. Now you can say, well, isn't lynching murder? And, so isn't it? That's what I first thought when I heard. Yes, murder is illegal in the United States. However, murder and murder cases are all decided by the individual states. So without a national law against lynching, we don't even know how many people die by violence at the hands of the police across the country. We don't know that. And unless there's huge popular pressure from the outside, these cases were not prosecuted. They weren't tried. So,
to go towards maybe trying to make something better, you say that we could to learn how to deal with the past. You've written a book with a controversial title as well, a bit, Learning from the Germans. And you say that the Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung could teach us something in how to deal, for instance, also with our colonial history. Could you really briefly tell me what the Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung is, and then what we could take from it?
Sure. What it translates to working off the past. And it's a multifaceted, multi-layered process. That involves bringing people to trial if they're still alive for crimes that they've committed in the past. That involves making new laws if you need to. The United States still needs an anti-lynching law. It involves making sure that history is examined, and I don't just mean in school books, but definitely it needs to be taught in school books. It also needs to be taught in public institutions, in museums, in literature, in film. Different voices need to be brought into all of those arts. And the public landscape needs to be changed in certain ways. I mean, the issue about the monuments that are coming down is sometimes described as, well, they're our history. The people want to keep them, say, don't do away with my history.
No, they say they give some context, and yes.
Yeah. But we don't memorialize everything that happened in history, right? Monuments are values made visible. Monuments are, when we build a monument to someone, we are saying this man or woman embodied values that I would like my city to uphold, that I would like my children to walk by and see. And, if it turns out that the monument was to King Leopold or to a major slaveholder, those belong in museums. Mm-hmm. And then we need to have a democratic discussion, ideally, of what we do. So there are gray areas, there are cases. And there are lots of things that can happen besides monuments, yes or no. You can contextualize. You can put up other monuments. I mean, then you can decide we need to figure out who our heroes are now and what values we would like to uphold. So all of those things, I think and every country has its own special set of questions. As I understand it, Black Pete is an issue in
absolutely
Holland.
Yes,
it's not an issue in other places. No. But there are other problems in other places. So I think this is, you cannot, when I say we can learn from the Germans, I certainly don't mean that the cases are identical, nor am I saying you can somehow transfer what happened in Germany to other countries. But you can learn two things. One is that this Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, it needs to be multifaceted. It needs to involve a whole range of things. The arts do it very, very well, I must say. If I can say this on a personal note, I was really touched when one of my daughters said to me, who's been demonstrating, she said, you didn't teach me not to be racist. You gave me Maya Angelou's book when I was 3. And then you gave me Toni Morrison when I was much too young to read it, when I was 12. And, it just went like that. That is, arts have an enormous role in giving us a perspective on other cultures. And it's true, I didn't. It was obvious for me to do. I didn't tell my children, be nice to Black people, or you should be interested in Black history. I just said, this is a book. I'm giving you this book.
Yes.
And that's, I think, how it has to happen. So that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we can learn most generally from the Germans, and this is a surprise to most people outside Germany, it was not easy. And the Germans spent a very long time, certainly the West Germans more than the East Germans, the Germans spent a very long time seeing themselves as the worst victim of the war and not as perpetrators. I think most people looking at Germany from the outside think, my God, what they did was so criminal that they must have immediately realized it and begged for atonement. They didn't. And in a way, that's normal. Mm-hmm. We would like to see our fathers, mothers, son, as heroes, or our nation as heroes. If we can't see them as heroes, the next best thing is to see them as victims. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very hard to make this transition to saying, they were victims, but actually they committed crimes. And it's a process that takes time. There will be resistance to it because it's just psychologically really hard to go through. Mm-hmm. But it's possible to go through it. And, I think it's very important that nations and individuals have heroes. I am not arguing for a 180-degree turn, saying, oh my God, we were just awful. That is actually something that happened in Germany for a while, a generation of people who kind of came of age in the 60s, mm-hmm. where everything in German culture was seen as terrible and mm-hmm. shameful, and you couldn't read Goethe because somehow Goethe led to...
the Third Reich, yes.
And that's changing now to the point where people are working out an idea of how you can have a healthy relationship towards your country that is both healthy and honest. And I make the analogy that it's like having a relationship to your parents that's healthy and honest. Unless your parents were just absolute nightmares, you can, and it's important to be a healthy adult, you sift through the lessons that you got from your parents, and you can find things that you're going to reject mm-hmm. and say, no, I'm going to live my life differently. But it's very important that you also find something of which you can say, yes, I'm glad they taught me that, and that's what I would like to give to the next generation. And it's a process that nations need to do as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's a process, and that's my last question, it's also a process you write at the end of your essay, that it's also maybe could be a European process, if we would go through this, that would lead to a more shared European memory.
Yes, I do. And I don't think that has happened. I think there's been a huge difference between Western European and Eastern European memory, but, that has not been honestly dealt with. People have sort of decided, okay, well, we'll paper that over for the moment because we have other problems to deal with. I think that has caused problems for the present European Union, but you said you wanted to leave some time for questions.
Yes.
So if we're going to leave time for questions,
I think it's a good time.
We can't get into that in detail.
Yeah. Okay. First question. Can you think of a minimal political and economic denominator combining the divergent interest of the northern and southern countries in Europe? A question from Arno Ambrosius.
Well, I'm not sure that I understand the question entirely. I would say that the shared social framework that I was talking about in the beginning needs to be equally shared between East and West. And obviously, because of the way the European Union is set up, people in wealthier northern countries will have, or northern and Western countries, will have more prosperity. But I actually think this new proposal between Merkel and Macron that the Christian Democrats in the German parliament just agreed on for the first time, that one actually comes up with a shared economic structure between North and South, is a very hopeful moment. And that, again, I have not looked into all the details of the economic proposal, so I don't want to be making a claim about the details. I just see it as a hopeful step in the direction of saying, at the very least, any member of the European Union needs to have guaranteed, healthcare, education, set of labor rights that go for everyone.
Thank you. The second question is, what do you see as the future for the European Union? Also a question from Arno Ambrosius.
So I have to say, again, if you become what I have become, which is one of the public intellectuals, the thing that people seem most to want from you is not that you're a public intellectual, but that you're a prophet. They want to know how things are going to come out. I don't know how things are going to come out. What I can do is talk about possibility, okay? Not prediction, but possibility. And for quite some time, I have been urging Europeans to appreciate what it is that they have and what it is that they have built. And we have this very odd situation that actually the people generally on the left who ought to be the biggest supporters of the European Union are often its worst critics. Yes, Brussels is based on a neoliberal economic structure. I would prefer it was different, but that's what it is. Yes, there's a big wealth gap between North and South. Yes, the promise of the European Union has not entirely been fulfilled. But instead of saying the ideals were right, let us work to fulfill them, what the people who should be the strongest defenders of Europe do is become its strongest critics. And it seems to me very important to recognize that Europe was built on a set of ideals. And the ideals are not confined to, all things considered, it would be better if we didn't kill each other. Which is often pointed to, people say, well, there hasn't been war. I mean, except in the former Yugoslavia, and we should appreciate that. Yes, we should appreciate that, no question about it. But there's another set of values that I was trying to express in my essay that need to be appreciated if we're going to fight for them. I strongly believe that the European Union could fulfill those values, at least, to a very great extent, if people, if good people got behind it. I also think that if it doesn't, Europe will be, insignificant in 50 years. And of course, I'm not the first person to say that. The other countries are, the other centers of power simply won't allow for there to be a strong, Great Britain, Germany, France, Holland. It's not going to happen. And when people complain to me about Europe, I want to say, okay, I see what the problems are. I'm not denying them. Would you prefer to take your values from the United States? Would you prefer to take them from China? Would you prefer to take them from India? Would you prefer to take them from Russia? Those are the other great powers. And at this moment, it's really not clear that they have values, except for my country comes first. Okay. And you can say, of course, that part of the problems in Europe is that everybody is still kind of my country comes first, and we haven't been able to fully unite. And nevertheless, there is a set of values that you don't see in any of the other great powers. And the question is, will we learn in time to fight for those values?
Thank you. I have one last question, if that's okay. Does the rise of populist/nationalist parties in Europe has something to do with the fact that there are only a few people left who lived during World War II? A question of Rogaya Sek.
No, I think it has to do with something else. Because, I mean, that may play a role, but I don't think it's a central role. I think it has to do largely with the fact that people feel out of control of their lives. And it's not that they think that Brussels is in control, although sometimes you get populist parties who say it's Brussels' fault. I think it's because we are not actually in control of our lives. Politicians are not in control of the way things are. Global neoliberal corporations are the forces that make most of the decisions in our lives. They're also responsible for the fact that if you do travel, the world is increasingly looking identical. The same shops and the same symbols and the same pictures in many places all over the world. And I think people are rightly sick of it. They don't have the patience to work through a more complicated argument. And so the easiest thing to do, particularly since there are these quite sinister politicians who are happy to exploit those feelings of powerlessness, they turn to nationalism, which is always the simplest thing to turn to in a crisis. My tribe is the best and the other tribes are at fault. So I think it's much more structural problems about the way the world works right now than a lack of historical memory.
Thank you. And also thank you very much for being here. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I hope to see you soon in Amsterdam to speak about these topics more if the travel ban is restricted.
I am scheduled to give a talk in mid-October, so hopefully,
fingers crossed,
if we don't get a horrible second wave, I'll be in Amsterdam in October.
Great. Thank you again, and thank you also for watching. This was the first episode of People of Europe. There's another one on the 26th of June with Geraldine Swartz and Abraham de Zwaan. And tickets are available at the website of the Bali. The essay of Susan will be published in het FD somewhere this summer. And after that, it will also be readable on the website of the Bali. And this program was made with the funding of vfonds and curated in the run-up to the Forum on European Culture that will take place from 17th till 20th of September. And we hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, Jan.
Bye.